What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. Jake and I are here today to ask and answer the question, are these three former fantasy darlings finished? And we're talking about wide receivers today. We're going to be talking about Jameson Williams, Rashod Bateman, and Jeudy. Three guys who, former first-round picks, high-level talents, haven't quite worked out the way that we all expected, or some of us expected. I can't say all of us, but first, I want to set the stage a little bit here. In preparation for this video, I pulled up some data on wide receivers. I wanted to see wide receivers who haven't hit by year 3 and kind of what they've done thereafter. And the data is pretty damning. What I found is that if you haven't hit a top 24 season by your 3rd year, you have basically a 2% chance of ever hitting a top 12 season. If you've hit one top 12 season by year 3, you have a 37% chance of hitting a top 24 season thereafter. So let's really just dive into it. I wanted to set the stage there, but let's get into talking about Jameson Williams. Okay, wide receiver 50, 122 overall, fairly affordable if you want to go after him. I want to talk a little bit about the profile because when we first, we did a video on Treylon Burks, we're talking about, these guys being misevaluated, right? Do you think that Jameson Williams was misevaluated by the fantasy community and by the NFL?
I think to some extent, yes. Jameson Williams is one of those weird players who I think has a lot of circumstantial components around him that has made him not be able to fit into the NFL yet. That's a mixture of, gambling suspension plus injury. But I do think that there's something unique about his profile that I personally try and drive as far away from, right? We're talking about players who basically have usually one unique trait. And I'm not calling it an elite trait. I'm calling it a unique trait. And for him, I really do just find that it kind of structures itself around speed. And the rest of his game, from route running, from his entire route tree at Alabama, just didn't necessarily define itself to me as a player that would process well into the NFL. What about you?
Yeah, I think that you're kind of right on point with that. I think part of it for me was he lacked nuance in terms of route running. Now, I think because he was so fast, he was able to flash these signs of good route running, good technique, right? And it definitely looked really good, especially at the collegiate level against collegiate defenders. But I don't think that translated very well to the NFL. And I do agree that he relies on athleticism more than anything. So I do think that those are really the flaws. And again, going back to the data that we pulled, we're looking at year 3 because the 3 guys we're talking about kind of fit somewhere within this window, right? Jameson Williams is heading into year 3. So this is the make or break year in terms of, the hit rate data. Jeudy, hit one time in his 4 years, a top 24 season. And then Rashod Bateman, who is not hit in 3 years going into his 4th year, right? We're going to see what'll happen there. But the data is definitely damning for these 3 players. But do you think that there's still hope for Jameson Williams? Because this is the one guy who hasn't really hit that year 3. We literally just got a buzz on our phones about, Jameson Williams is going to step up this year. He's going to be the wide receiver 2 next to Amon-Ra. And you see that depth chart. It's pretty barren. I mean, Donovan Peoples-Jones is really, other than Khalif Raymond, who's probably going to play anyway, Donovan Peoples-Jones is really the only guy who could maybe step up in front of him or play the similar role that Jameson Williams is going to, expected to, and DPJ has shown some success in that role in the past. So what do you think? Is there still hope?
If there's anything about roster construction that we know of, it really does define itself for the players in the system. And I think with a team that kind of has the outlook that the Lions do in 2024, it does say that they do believe in the talent at bare minimum. Whether or not they think it's going to hit or not, I think they have to play their odds. They gave up so much draft capital for him in the sense of drafting him at the 112. I think he was a 12th pick overall that year. Wide receiver 4 in 2022. And at this point, I think it's really about kind of making sure your investment hits as best as you can. Now, I think there's probably some negligence to that, but at the end of the day, they haven't made that big splash move in the offseason because they've paid Jared Goff. They've paid Amon-Ra St. Brown. Um, there's a lot of folks on their team that are also in the window of getting paid coming up soon. So it's like he's kind of in that weird flux position for me that if he doesn't hit in year 3, I do think that they'll probably go a different direction for year 4. Even though he'll still be on a rookie contract, I just think that they'll see that, there's too many limitations. What about you?
There may be some hope here for Jameson Williams, but I think over my dynasty journey, my dynasty career, I've really shied away from these kind of players, tried to avoid these kind of profiles because more times than not, based on the data, they're not going to hit. Now he's probably somewhere in between that 37% and that 2% given, he still has that year 3 to go, but I think that it's pretty bleak, the outlook. So for me, I'm out. I'd like to move on. If people still have hope, I think that we can maybe add him, package him in, and plus up to, tier up a couple tiers maybe, because people are still high on this guy. He is a first round pick, like Jake mentioned, 12th overall. I think they traded up for him, if I remember correctly. So they have plenty invested in this guy, and I understand why maybe the dynasty community would still want to. But we here at Dynasty Underdog are out. Let's talk a little bit about Jerry Jeudy, wide receiver 53, 134th overall, looking at ADP, and we're referencing Dynasty Data Lab there, just so you know. So, this is going back a little bit to 2020. We have to think back. But do we think that Jerry Jeudy was misevaluated by the dynasty community and the NFL community, or was it just situationally terrible for him? Because I tend to lean on the latter side of that. I do think that Jerry Jeudy was a much better route runner than a guy like Jameson Williams. These both Alabama guys, we can draw a lot of parallels, but I think much better route runner. I think just technically sound. He ends up in a situation where he never has a quarterback, where there's injuries. He's experienced injuries, head coaching changes, all sorts of things. So am I just, seeing what I want to see here, putting on rose-colored glasses because I like Jerry Jeudy coming out, or was he misevaluated in some way?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting because I do think when you watch the tape of him in college versus Jerry Jeudy, the NFL player, they don't actually look the same. When you go back into Jameson Williams, it is very much the same player, regardless of the injuries that he had. There's definitely that nuance, I think, we've talked about this before, player confidence. And I think that player confidence is really what has diminished relatively quickly with a player like Jerry Jeudy. And sometimes that just never comes back. Honestly, that's one of those situations where I personally don't see this wide receiver room as being the most advantageous for Jeudy, given that they still have Elijah Moore that they traded for last year. They still have Cedric Tillman, who they spent a third-round draft capital on the year prior. They still have David Bell. They still drafted Jamari Thrash. There's just lots of bodies there, right? And I'm not saying that these are great names. All I'm saying is that there's a lot of competition, and I don't think that they've invested that much in Jerry Jeudy for him to necessarily succeed. Obviously, Amari Cooper, wide receiver 1, David Njoku, tight end 1. These are all target hogs that are going to take away from Jerry Jeudy's success. Do I think that he has the opportunity right now? Absolutely. But for me personally, I just don't know if it's more of a misevaluation, but also just kind of a misevaluation from him and his agent's part of where that next landing spot is. I think if he found himself maybe in Detroit as, that wide receiver 3 on the depth chart behind Jameson Williams, he'd actually be in a much more advantageous position than kind of in this cluttered wide receiver room in Cleveland.
Yeah. And, speaking to that draft capital that he does have, the first round DC, 15th overall, kind of goes out the window when you get traded to another team, right? So the investment that we're talking about with Jameson Williams, that I think, the Lions are kind of stuck with, I don't think that the Browns are going to feel that. So to your point, with all the bodies there, and maybe the diminished confidence, that is going to play a part in it. Where he's going in drafts, though, looking at Jerry Jeudy around Romeo Doubs, around Jahan Dotson, around Jameson Williams, I mean, you'd probably rather Jerry Jeudy than Jameson Williams at this point still. Maybe even more than a Jahan Dotson, but maybe Jahan Dotson is even a better profile at this point than a Jerry Jeudy. I'm just trying to see if his profile is appealing at all, kind of just speaking to, is there any hope for this? And I mean, his situation, I think it's a little bit better than Jameson Williams, but laying out kind of the depth chart there and the way you did, I'm kind of rethinking that. Do you think that there's any hope with Jerry Jeudy left?
I would say in terms of just like pure side by side comparison with Jameson Williams, it's a more challenging path, I think, to success, just given the number of bodies.
Mhm.
But the contract that he ended up getting in Cleveland was still pretty decent. I think it was a 3 year, $42.5 million deal. They don't think he's completely washed. This isn't a player that the NFL has completely given up on. And to your point, I do think that draft capital still kind of matters. Funny enough,
Mhm.
I do think that these organizations, when they scout these players coming into the NFL, they do weigh pretty heavily on their own analysis of how those players perform in college. And so, more often than not, these guys are kind of mismanaged more often than necessarily misevaluated. And to your point, the things that happened
Yeah.
in Denver during his time there were pretty chaotic, which can kind of drive this narrative for a player. But me personally, I don't have that much hope for Jerry Jeudy, but I've always kind of been out on him.
Mismanaged is a great word because I do think that's exactly what happened, right? It wasn't necessarily a misevaluation. I don't know if anybody got anything wrong, but he was mismanaged. The situation was mismanaged. Everything about it has been mismanaged. And again, looking at the ADP, there's kind of some players I'd want to trade him for, like just looking around. I mean, even a pick like in his range 207, but I just don't see that happening in the market, to be honest with you. So I think you're going to have to hold the bag here and try to sell if he pops and that hope does show its face. But yeah, I kind of tend to agree with Jake here. I want to get out of these profiles a little bit, like I said with Jameson Williams. We're hearing a lot of buzz about this next guy, Rashod Bateman, wide receiver 81, 200th overall. Definitely the most palatable price of any of these wide receivers. Man, this is a guy who I really think was misevaluated by just about everybody. I thought he was kind of weak through his routes. I thought he was just a bit, I don't want to say lazy, but lackadaisical on the field from play to play. And even through his routes, I thought press coverage was tough for him. I never really saw him as a wide receiver one. I saw him as a guy who could be a wide receiver two. And I think that Baltimore drafted him thinking that they could get a wide receiver one talent out of him. And so from kind of every aspect of it, what people were expecting from, a fantasy perspective, what the NFL was expecting in terms of what they were getting, I just did not see that there. And this also is the only player that made it past, the 15th overall pick in the draft, which I think kind of highlights maybe the uncertainty there by teams in general, but still that's what they were expecting. Did you kind of see what I was seeing there, or do you think that, it was a situation issue?
No, I completely agree. And, funny enough, we talk about all three of these players and we do talk about injuries. Rashod Bateman definitely is the one most impacted by injury
Mhm.
of the three. And the funny thing is that when I think about his profile and how I viewed him in college, is kind of similar to that of Jordan Addison. I did think that he had a really, really tough time beating the press. By all means, I do think that Addison is exceptionally better overall with the rest of his game. But
Mhm.
specifically with beating the press was always an issue for me because I always saw him potentially being more utilized as a slot receiver. But in the slot, if you're not moving in motion, you're basically useless if you can't beat the press. So it's like how the teams are using him, I think, is really the most important. And we do know that, you know, for his first year at least, he was stagnated at bare minimum by Greg Roman's offense, right? Or first 2 years. And going into last year, I think there was a lot of optimism with the hope that we'd finally start to see the real Rashod Bateman. But I think injuries also played a huge part. And we saw, Zay Flowers and Isaiah Likely kind of being the two pieces that flourished the most due to Mark Andrews' injury and the Rashod Bateman injury. Now, for me, like I think that kind of drives into the is there still hope conversation. This
Mhm.
is like you said, Billy, like the most palatable acquisition cost for me for a player that I think potentially has a space to succeed. But given, I think, the overall profile, I'm still probably out. It just doesn't make sense for me to invest in right now. What about you?
Yeah, I think the consensus, unfortunately, on these three players is that they are finished. And there's a lot of hopium going around with these guys. There's a lot of buzz going around with Jameson Williams, Jerry Jeudy on a new team with a new deal, Rashod Bateman having a big year. He's ready to go. We're hearing it from the coaches. So, I think the dynasty community is going to be amped up to kind of get a couple shares of these guys. And I would just caution them to really think hard about what you're spending on them. Again, Rashod Bateman certainly can be had for pretty low cost. So I'm not going to, shame anybody who's going to do that, but be careful with what you spend on these players because you could be left holding a bag that you are really uncomfortable with 6 months to a year from now. So, just finish off this conversation real quick here. We have 3 similar players, I feel like, right? In terms of kind of their career arcs. Do we think that there's any skills, traits, anything that these players possess that we can kind of avoid in the future? Or is this just a player by player thing that we're working with here?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing is going to always be the physicality of wide receivers in the NFL. With that transgression or progression from college. Like the big thing that I've always noticed, we talk about Jameson Williams and we talk about Rashod Bateman. We kind of covered some similarities there, specifically with beating the press, specifically just being physical off the line, being able to get away with that with just pure athleticism, pure speed, just doesn't necessarily translate to the NFL, especially depending on how you're being used. I think good NFL teams, good NFL coaches know how to manipulate those situations for those players to be successful. But that doesn't mean that they all will. I think of a player almost like a Chris Olave. He's not necessarily the best at beating the press off of pure strength, but he is great with his feet. And that's how he gets out of the press. Now, you need to be able to develop that as a player, like Rashod Bateman, like Jameson Williams would. But the fact is that we never really saw that from their game to begin with. So it's really challenging to see them venture off into that space unless they really have a wide receiver coach that can drive them to that direction. And that's something that I thought. What about you? What are some similarities that you've seen?
Yeah, I mean, I think those are actually really great points. What I thought of was the injuries. All of these guys have had injuries, and then you're talking about a Chris Olave who can beat these guys, with his footwork, with his route technique. And I think back to a Jeudy who's had these ankle issues and all of these injuries that are really going to impact your ability to cut and put pressure on these defenders. So that's what I think back to with these guys when injuries really impact these players early in their career and often. It doesn't matter that it was an injury. The history shows if they don't produce by year 3, they don't produce a top 24 season by year 3, they're unlikely to ever do so thereafter. And if they've only hit 1 by then, they're still unlikely to do so thereafter, just a little bit more likely. So we need to be really, really, really cautious with these profiles and know what we're getting into, right? I think that's the biggest thing. People kind of just hope that they're going to get better and not actually know, oh, this guy has like a 2% chance of actually getting to where I want him to get to. And am I willing to take that risk? And I think that's where we are. And that's what we're trying to get across here. So unfortunately, I think the answer to the question here is these players are finished in terms of fantasy. That sucks. We don't ever want to say that, but that's where we're at. So do what you will with that information. We appreciate y'all being here. We really, really do appreciate y'all tuning in. Please like and subscribe if you enjoyed what we're putting down. Jake, thank you for being here as always. We'll catch you next time. Peace out.